8 meters of abyss between windows, too little to hide, too much to touch. When the lights go out, whose loneliness will ignite first? Stare into the darkness. There, across the way, is your ruin, or your salvation. We are about to hear this story right now. The incessant drumming of October rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass of her 9th-floor apartment felt less like weather and more like a physical barrier, sealing her away from the sprawling metallic beast of London. Hermione Granger dragged her thumb over the rim of her ceramic mug, feeling the rough, unglazed clay contrast with the scalding heat of the black tea inside. The city below was a smear of bleeding neon lights, and the hollow echo of tires slicing through deep puddles, completely muted by the thick, double-paned glass of her sanctuary. Her sanctuary was, by all conventional standards, flawed. 6 months ago, in the dead of winter, the heavy, rusted curtain rod that spanned the width of her living room window had violently wrenched itself free from the crumbling plaster. It had come down with a jarring impact in the middle of the night, taking the heavy blackout drapes and a substantial chunk of the ceiling with it. For the first few days, the stark, uncovered glass had felt like an open wound. The adjacent residential high-rise across the narrow, brick-paved alleyway loomed entirely too close, its dark, identical windows staring back at her like unblinking eyes. But as the weeks bled into months, the crushing demands of her position at the city's most ruthless corporate acquisitions firm left her with no time and even less energy to hire a contractor. Eventually, the bare window became a strange, silent rebellion. She had embraced the anonymity of the metropolis, convincing herself that out of the millions of souls packed into the suffocating grid of the city, no one cared to look into the softly lit, disorganized living room of a solitary woman. She was a ghost behind glass, moving through the routines of her private life with the unbothered freedom of someone completely unseen. Or so she had believed. Hermione set her mug down on the edge of her cluttered desk, the dull clink of ceramic against oak swallowed by the hum of her aging refrigerator. She stretched her arms above her head, feeling the sharp, agonizing pull of tight muscles in her shoulders. Her bare feet padded softly against the worn hardwood as she moved toward the center of the living room. Resting on the edge of her velvet armchair was a heavy, leather-bound case. Ginny had left it behind 3 days ago, abandoning her expensive pair of field binoculars after a failed attempt to spot a rare falcon nesting on the spire of a nearby cathedral. The binoculars themselves were a beautiful, vintage piece of equipment, cold, brushed brass and thick glass lenses. Driven by a sudden, idle curiosity, born more of procrastination from her pending legal briefs than genuine interest, Hermione picked them up. The brass was cool against her skin. She lifted the heavy apparatus to her eyes, adjusting the textured focus dial. She didn't look down at the street. Instead, she let the lenses sweep lazily across the imposing stone facade of the building directly opposite hers. The gap between their buildings was no more than 40 feet, an architectural oversight from a bygone era that created a perpetual shadow in the alley below. Through the magnified glass, the rain looked like a veil of silver threads slicing through the darkness. She panned past dark, empty squares of glass, past a window where the faint blue flicker of a television illuminated a sleeping cat, past another that was entirely obscured by an overgrown jungle of indoor ferns. And then she leveled the binoculars at the apartment directly across from her own. For the last 6 months, that specific window had been a void, an unlit, silent rectangle that she had mentally categorized as vacant. Tonight, however, it was not dark. A single low-wattage floor lamp had been switched on in the corner of the opposite room, casting long, dramatic shadows across minimalist, monochromatic furniture. The walls were painted a deep, oppressive charcoal. There were no bookshelves, no vibrant rugs, no scattered coffee cups. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end waiting room, sterile and precisely calculated. Hermione's finger paused on the focus dial. A figure was standing in the center of that room. The breath stalled entirely in her throat. The sudden, frantic need to drop the binoculars fought against a paralyzing shock that rooted her feet to her own floorboards. Standing there, perfectly framed by the window casing, was Draco Malfoy. The magnification was sharp enough that she could see the precise, tailored lines of his dark waistcoat, the stark contrast of his crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose the pale skin of his forearms. She could see the faint, silvery gleam of the heavy signet ring on his left hand, the very same ring she had watched him tap mercilessly against mahogany conference tables in the boardroom. The metallic clack, 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 serving as a maddening metronome to his ruthless dismantling of her contracts. He was the bane of her professional existence, a man whose very presence altered the atmospheric pressure of any room he entered, replacing the air with a sharp, cold scent of chilled cedar and ozone. He was arrogant, deeply cynical, and carried himself with a quiet, lethal grace that suggested he viewed the rest of the world as merely a mild inconvenience. For 3 years, their rivalry had been defined by a visceral alignment of opposing forces. She with her meticulous, burning dedication, and he with his effortless, terrifying brilliance. And he lived directly across the street. The heavy binoculars began to tremble against Hermione's face. The static in her ears drowned out the sound of the rain. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't on his phone. He was standing perfectly still, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his dark trousers, staring out into the night. He was staring directly into her living room. A hot, suffocating wave of realization crashed over her, burning the tips of her ears and flushing her chest with an agonizing heat. He lived there. He had lived there this entire time. The mental archives of the last 6 months flipped open in her mind, a devastating montage of exposure. The nights she had paced back and forth across the rug in nothing but an oversized, threadbare university t-shirt, muttering closing arguments to herself. The evening she had collapsed on the floor after losing the Miller account, her shoulders shaking with silent, exhausted sobs as she drank cheap wine straight from the bottle. The Sunday mornings she had danced wildly, unapologetically to old vinyl records, singing into a wooden spoon. The moments of unguarded, profound loneliness, when she had simply stood by the glass, resting her forehead against the cold pane, wishing for someone to understand the crushing weight of her days. He had seen it all. Every fractured, hidden piece of her that she spent 12 hours a day meticulously concealing behind tailored blazers and razor-sharp intellect. Her knuckles turned completely white as her grip on the brass barrels tightened. The tactile friction of his unseen gaze over the past 6 months felt suddenly real, a phantom touch crawling over her skin. She felt violently exposed, stripped down to her nerves. The urge to dive to the floor, to crawl on her hands and knees to the light switch and plunge her apartment into total darkness was overpowering. She wanted to hide. She wanted to build a brick wall over the glass. But as she watched him through the lenses, Malfoy slowly withdrew his right hand from his pocket. He held a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid inside catching the dim light of his lamp. He didn't raise it to his lips. Instead, he lifted the glass slightly in the air, a microscopic tilt of his wrist. A silent, mocking toast directed straight at her brightly lit, entirely uncurtained window. He knew she was there. He knew she was looking. And he wanted her to know that he had been watching. The suffocating humiliation abruptly crystallized into something else. The trembling in her hands stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant tremor of pure, unadulterated fury. The magnetic pull of her own stubborn pride snapped her spine straight. If he expected her to cower, if he expected her to panic and draw the blinds on her own life just because he had violated the unspoken rules of urban anonymity, he was vastly underestimating her. Hermione lowered the binoculars. The illusion of distance returned, shrinking him back into a dark silhouette in a distant square of light. But the awareness of him was absolute. She didn't move toward the light switch. She didn't step back into the shadows of her hallway. Instead, Hermione took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving until her toes touched the baseboard directly beneath the glass. The bite of the autumn chill radiating from the window seeped through her cotton socks. She stood tall, crossing her arms defensively over her chest, and stared back across the 40 feet of rain-slicked emptiness. Even without the magnification, she could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of his attention locked onto her. The space between their buildings was no longer just an alleyway. It was a charged, crackling current of hostility. He was a silent, grey spectre in the dark, a man burdened by an internal coldness she had always sensed, but never cared to understand. And now he had invaded the only place in the world where she allowed herself to be fragile. A jagged streak of lightning illuminated the sky, flashing a stark, blinding white across the facades of both buildings. For a fraction of a second, his features were illuminated. The sharp angle of his chin, the shadowed hollows beneath his eyes, and the intense, unyielding focus of his stare. He didn't look away. Hermione's jaw clenched so tightly, her teeth ached. She planted her feet firmly against the floorboards, lifting her chin in a silent, rigid challenge. The storm outside raged violently against the glass, but the true atmospheric pressure had localized entirely in the space between their eyes. The silent war had begun, and neither of them was willing to be the first to surrender to the dark. The following 48 hours were defined by a suffocating, unrelenting atmospheric pressure. The glass pane of her living room window, once a transparent shield against the metropolis, had transformed into a two-way mirror, reflecting a silent psychological war. Hermione refused to retreat. To draw away from the glass now, to hide in the windowless safety of her narrow hallway, would be a concession of defeat. It would be an admission that Draco Malfoy possessed the power to dictate the terms of her sanctuary. So, she weaponized her routine. She dragged her wingback chair closer to the precipice of the 9th floor. Under the harsh, interrogating glare of a halogen reading lamp, She spent her Saturday poring over dense acquisition contracts. The tooth of old parchment and stiff legal paper scraped against her fingertips as she forcefully turned the pages, making sure her silhouette was crisp and unmistakable against the night. She did not look up. She kept her eyes anchored to the black ink, her jaw set so rigidly a dull ache radiated into her temples. Across the narrow alleyway, the magnetic pull of his apartment was a physical weight against her peripheral vision. He did not turn on his floor lamp again. Instead, his presence was announced by the sharp metallic snap of a lighter and the subsequent brief flare of orange illuminating the sharp planes of his face. He sat in the impenetrable shadows of his charcoal-painted living room, the glowing ember of a cigarette mapping his quiet, predatory stillness. The tactile friction of his unseen gaze crawled over the nape of her neck, a heavy, phantom touch that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. He was watching her read. He was watching her pretend not to notice him. The static between their buildings hummed louder than the endless London traffic below. By Monday morning, the internal exhaustion of maintaining this armor was wearing her dangerously thin. The transition from the isolation of her apartment to the brutal, waking world of the financial district offered no relief. It only hastened the inevitable jarring impact of their shared reality. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing mist as Hermione pushed open the heavy glass door of the artisanal coffee shop nestled on the ground floor of her building. The entry bell chimed, a cheerful, hollow sound completely at odds with the damp chill clinging to her beige trench coat. The scent of roasted espresso beans and caramelized sugar hit her immediately, offering a fleeting, false sense of comfort. She stepped into the queue, shaking the moisture from her umbrella, the hollow echo of footsteps from the morning commuters blending into a dull, white roar. Then, the air in the room fundamentally changed. The ambient noise seemed to thin, sucked into a vacuum of sudden, heavy tension. Hermione didn't need to turn around to know he had walked in. The visceral alignment of their proximity manifested as a sudden, erratic flutter in her pulse. She forced her eyes forward, staring blankly at the handwritten chalkboard menu above the barista, her grip tightening on the handle of her umbrella. A double espresso, black, and whatever the woman in the damp coat is having, put it on my card. The voice was a low, aristocratic drawl, perfectly pitched to cut through the hum of the cafe. It was the exact same voice that regularly tore her legal arguments to shreds in sunlit boardrooms. But here, laced with a terrifyingly casual intimacy, it felt like a physical invasion. Hermione turned slowly. The bite of a silver signet ring caught the harsh fluorescent light as Malfoy handed a sleek, black card to the cashier. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that emphasized the broad line of his shoulders, a dark cashmere scarf neatly tucked at his throat. He looked wealthy, untouchable, and utterly detached. But as his pale grey eyes shifted to lock onto hers, she saw the faint, telltale tightening of the muscles along his jawline. "I am perfectly capable of paying for my own oat milk flat white, Malfoy," she said, her voice dropping into a register of icy professionalism. She stepped out of the queue, closing the distance between them just enough to ensure their conversation remained private. The interference of his imposing frame so close to her physical space made her chest tight. "Cancel the transaction." Malfoy didn't blink. He smoothly retrieved his card and slipped it into his breast pocket. Consider it a neighbourly gesture, Granger, a belated welcome to the block. We've lived across from each other for over a year. Yes, he murmured, taking a deliberate, agonizingly slow step closer. The scent of chilled ozone, expensive bergamot, and the faint, bitter ghost of cigarette smoke enveloped her. But it seems we've only just been introduced to the real you, or rather, the version of you that insists on treating the entire borough of Kensington to a nightly performance. The heat of sudden, visceral humiliation flooded her cheeks, burning the tips of her ears, but she immediately weaponized it into fury. Her fingers curled so tightly around the leather strap of her briefcase that her knuckles turned a bloodless white. She refused to give him the satisfaction of looking away, tilting her chin up to meet his cold stare. If my life offends your delicate sensibilities, you are more than welcome to look away, she retorted, her words clipped and breathless. Or are you making a habit of lurking in the dark, monitoring women who simply want to exist in their own homes? A shadow, dark and violently complex, passed over his eyes. For a fraction of a second, the immaculate armor of his indifference cracked, revealing the chaotic tremor beneath. His posture went completely rigid. The accusation landed like a physical blow, striking at a hidden, agonizing core of guilt he carried with exhausting precision. He was a man who spent his life meticulously controlling his environment to avoid causing damage, convinced he was a toxic influence on anything pure. Yet here he was, entirely unable to tear his eyes away from the one person whose unguarded moments had become the only anchor in his isolated existence. But Malfoy was a master of evasion. He swallowed the reaction instantly, burying the fracture beneath a mask of cruel, arrogant disdain. He leaned down, his lips mere inches from her ear, lowering his voice to a silken, venomous whisper. Don't flatter yourself, Granger. You aren't that fascinating. The lack of basic decorum is merely an eyesore. It's distracting. He straightened up, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth, looking down his nose at her. Buy some blinds, for everyone's sake. He didn't wait for his espresso. He turned on his heel, the heavy wool of his coat sweeping elegantly around his legs, and walked back out into the freezing mist, leaving her standing entirely frozen in the middle of the crowded shop. The barista called her name twice before she registered the sound. Hermione took her paper cup with trembling hands. The jarring impact of his cruelty echoed in her skull, drowning out the clatter of porcelain and the hiss of the steam wands. It wasn't just an insult. It was a deliberate, calculated strike meant to push her as far away as possible. He had taken her vulnerability, the uncurtained window she had stubbornly defended as a symbol of her independence, and reduced it to a grotesque display of indecency. She survived the workday mechanically, reviewing contracts and drafting emails with a hollow, detached efficiency. The static in her mind refused to settle. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the harsh, unyielding line of his mouth, heard the absolute venom in his suggestion that her mere existence was an unbearable distraction. When she finally unlocked the door to her apartment that evening, the heavy, enveloping silence of the space felt entirely different. It no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a stage where the audience had thrown stones. She did not take off her damp coat. She walked slowly into the center of the living room. The night outside was an ink-black canvas, the city lights bleeding through the fog. Across the alley, his window was completely dark. He wasn't there, or if he was hiding deeper in the shadows than ever before. The fiery defiance that had fueled her through the weekend evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in her sternum. The tactile friction of his judgment lingered on her skin, making her feel small and painfully foolish. She had tried to be brave, tried to claim her space against his encroaching presence, but the emotional cost was suddenly too steep to pay. Her sanctuary was fundamentally compromised. The illusion of being unseen was shattered beyond repair, poisoned by his biting disdain. With a heavy, defeated sigh, Hermione walked over to the floor lamp beside her wingback chair. Her fingers traced the cold metal of the switch. The tremor in her hand was finally visible, a slight shaking that she couldn't suppress. She pressed the switch down. The bulb died with a soft click. She moved to the kitchen, switching off the overhead halogens. She walked down the hallway, killing their amber sconces. One by one, she systematically extinguished every single source of light in her apartment until there was nothing left but the oppressive, sprawling darkness. Hermione sat on the edge of her sofa in the pitch black, pulling her knees tight against her chest, the stiff fabric of her trench coat rustlings in the quiet. She stared out the bare glass at the towering black wall of his building. The repulsion had firmly taken root. The psychological war had shifted into a new, desolate phase. If he wanted the dark, she would give him the dark. She would become a ghost once more, disappearing entirely into the void, leaving him with absolutely nothing left to watch. For 72 agonizing hours, the 9th floor of the opposing residential block remained an impenetrable, suffocating void. Draco Malfoy stood in the center of his meticulously curated, profoundly empty living room, staring into the abyss he had single-handedly created. The heavy, leaden silence of his apartment was broken only by the rhythmic, merciless tick of his platinum wristwatch and the hollow echo of his own uneven breathing. He had won. He had delivered his cruel, calculated strike in the coffee shop, executing the exact maneuver required to drive her away and secure his isolation. Yet, the victory tasted like ash and copper in his mouth. He lifted his left hand, pressing his knuckles flat against the icy surface of the window pane. The bite of his silver signet ring against the glass grounded him for a fraction of a second, but the overwhelming atmospheric pressure of the room immediately crushed inward again. He had convinced himself that his harshness was a necessity. His life was a sterile, isolated equation, and she, with her sprawling, unapologetic emotions, her bare feet, her tears, her solitary dancing, was a chaotic variable that threatened to dismantle his fragile equilibrium. He had watched her for 6 months, a silent phantom drinking in the warmth of her unguarded existence, knowing he had absolutely no right to it. His guilt was a living, breathing entity, a heavy weight that curled tightly around his ribs. He had told her she was an eyesore, a distraction. He had dressed his profound self-loathing up as aristocratic arrogance, intending to sever the magnetic pull between them before his intrinsic darkness could bleed across the alleyway and taint her. But the absolute, uncompromising blackness of her apartment was a jarring impact he had not prepared for. It was not a retreat. It was an erasure. Across the gap, Hermione Granger was surviving in a self-imposed purgatory. The air in her flat felt incredibly thick, heavy with the static of unspoken words and unresolved anger. She navigated her once beloved space like a trespasser, relying solely on the sickly amber bleed of the street lamps below to find her way. The tooth of old parchment and the sharp corners of legal dossiers scraped against her palms as she stubbornly reviewed her firm's files by the pale bluish glow of her laptop screen. She kept the monitor angled severely toward the hallway, ensuring not a single stray photon would betray her presence to the window. She was freezing. Without the ambient heat of her lamps, and with the damp autumn chill seeping through the broken seal of the window frame, her sanctuary had become a mausoleum. She wore a heavy, oversized knit sweater, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed, though she refused to admit whether the tremor was from the cold or the adrenaline. The doubt began to creep in on the second night. The initial rush of defensive fury had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, aching vulnerability. Why was she doing this? Why was she allowing Draco Malfoy, a man who had spent 3 years systematically attempting to dismantle her professional confidence, to exile her to the dark? The tactile friction of his unseen gaze, which had once felt like an invasion, now left an agonizing phantom itch in its absence. The space between their buildings was no longer just an alley. It was a physical manifestation of the Cold War they were waging. She caught herself pausing in the middle of a sentence, her eyes drifting involuntarily toward the pitch-black rectangle across the street. Was he there? Was he sitting in his charcoal-painted armchair, smoking in the dark, waiting for her to break? Or had he simply moved on, utterly unbothered by the void he had demanded? The thought that he might not care at all sent a sharp, agonizing pang through her chest. It was a terrifying realization. The hostility had been excruciating, but the sheer, absolute indifference was somehow worse. The visceral alignment of their mutual isolation had bound them together, and now, severed, she felt entirely untethered. In the dark, she found herself frantically smoothing the cuffs of her sweater, a nervous habit attempting to impose order on a mind rapidly spiraling into chaos. By the evening of the third day, the tension had stretched into a thin, screaming wire. Draco had not slept. The pristine collar of his white dress shirt was unbuttoned, his silk tie discarded somewhere in the cavernous shadows of his hallway. The scent of ozone, bitter espresso, and stale nicotine clung to his clothes like a shroud. He stood by the glass, his pale eyes bloodshot, his posture a masterclass in rigid, agonizing restraint. His knuckles were entirely white as his hands gripped the marble windowsill, the veins in his forearms straining against the skin. He was a man starving to death, having violently slapped away the only light offered to him. His internal monologues were a relentless loop of condemnation. He had pushed her into the dark because he believed he was a destructive force, an observer who brought nothing but ruin. He had masked his desperate, pathetic craving for her warmth with cruel disdain, and she had responded with a finality that terrified him to his core. He pressed his forehead against the freezing pain. The chill radiated through his skull, a microscopic relief against the burning chaos inside his mind. He wanted to cross the street. He wanted to break down her door, to shatter the suffocating silence, to demand that she turn the lights back on and yell at him, curse him, anything to prove she was still there. He was completely, utterly broken beneath the facade of his tailored suits and corporate ruthlessness, held together only by the fragile routine he had built around watching her exist. "Turn it on," he whispered to the empty room, his voice a hoarse, fractured rasp that didn't sound like his own. "Granger, please." In her apartment, Hermione closed her laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. The sudden sound echoed hollowly against the bare walls. The blue light died, plunging her into total, uncompromising darkness once again. She sat in the pitch black, her chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. The physical and emotional cold was unbearable. She was Hermione Granger. She did not cower. She did not let arrogant, emotionally crippled men dictate the terms of her existence. She had built her life on a foundation of fierce, uncompromising independence, and sitting in the dark, afraid to be seen, was a fundamental betrayal of everything she was. The atmospheric pressure inside the room reached a critical mass. The repulsion she had intended to inflict upon him had turned inward, suffocating her own spirit. She could not live like a ghost simply to spite him. Slowly, she stood up. Her bare feet made no sound against the hardwood as she walked toward the center of the living room. The heavy, magnetic pull of the window drew her forward until she was standing just inches from the glass. She couldn't see him. The opposite building was a towering monolith of black brick and unlit windows, swallowed by the London fog. But she could feel him. The static in the air was so dense it tasted like copper on her tongue. It was a visceral, undeniable truth. He was there, in the dark, just as trapped in this silent war as she was. The tension between her profound resentment of his cruelty and the bizarre, inexplicable yearning for the phantom connection they had shared threatened to tear her in two. She reached out, her hand hovering blindly in the dark space beside her wingback chair. Her fingers brushed against the cold brass of the floor lamp switch. A severe, violent tremor ran up her arm. If she pressed it, she was surrendering her shield. She was stepping back onto the stage, naked and exposed to his judgment. She was inviting the interference back into her life. But as the hollow echo of the autumn wind howled through the narrow alleyway, Hermione realized that the pain of being seen was infinitesimally smaller than the agony of this profound, crushing isolation. She curled her fingers tightly around the metal switch. She closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath that filled her lungs with the scent of dust and rain, and pushed down. The soft, mechanical click of the brass switch sounded like a fractured bone snapping in the oppressive, leaden silence of her flat. Instantly, the bruised golden amber of the solitary tungsten bulb flared to life, tearing through the suffocating blackness that had imprisoned her for 3 days. The light spilled outward in a desperate, radiating pool, crawling across the worn floorboards, illuminating the chaotic stacks of neglected legal files and casting long, trembling shadows behind her wingback chair. It hit the expansive, uncurtained glass of her window and bled out into the damp, freezing fog of the London night. Hermione kept her eyes squeezed shut for a fraction of a second, her hand still frozen around the metal stem of the lamp. The frantic, erratic drumbeat of her pulse hammered against her ribs. She had surrendered her shield. The profound, aching vulnerability of exposing herself again made her stomach twist into a painful knot. She braced herself for the inevitable sneer, the arrogant tilt of his chin, the mocking raise of a crystal tumbler that would validate every ounce of her defensive fury. Slowly, she forced her eyelids open and lifted her chin to face the precipice. The breath vanished entirely from her lungs. Across the narrow, brick-paved chasm, Draco Malfoy was not hiding in the impenetrable shadows of his charcoal-painted walls. He was not lounging with cruel, detached amusement. He was standing mere inches from his own window, completely illuminated by the ambient bleed of her returning light. The immaculate, terrifying armor of the corporate predator she knew so well had been entirely stripped away. He wore no bespoke suit jacket. His crisp white dress shirt was deeply wrinkled, the collar unbuttoned, exposing the pale, tense line of his throat. His silver tie was discarded, and the sleeves were roughly pushed up to his elbows. But it was his posture that sent a violently sharp tremor through her veins. He was leaning forward, his head bowed slightly, his left hand pressed completely flat against the freezing glass. Even across the 40 feet of empty, rain-slicked air, she could see the bone-deep exhaustion painted into the harsh, aristocratic lines of his face. The dark, bruised shadows beneath his eyes spoke of nights spent pacing the floorboards, a silent phantom drowning in his own isolated purgatory. As the amber light from her apartment washed over him, he didn't flinch. He didn't step back. Instead, a visible, heavy shudder ripped through his broad shoulders. He slowly raised his head, his pale silver eyes locking onto hers with an intensity so raw and unguarded it felt like a physical strike to her sternum. The hostility, the biting disdain from the coffee shop, the bitter rivalry. It was all gone, evaporated in the sudden, blinding heat of this shared exposure. In that fractured moment, the atmospheric pressure between their buildings shifted irrevocably. The bitter repulsion fractured, revealing the desperate magnetic pull beneath. He looked utterly wrecked, and as Hermione stood there, trembling in her oversized knit sweater, her bare feet aching against the floorboards, she recognized the exact same wreckage mirrored in her own soul. They were two fiercely proud, incredibly lonely creatures, bleeding out in high-rise towers, violently pretending they didn't need a single soul in the world. She didn't move to grab her books. She didn't cross her arms defensively. She simply stood in the center of the light and let him look at her. The tactile friction of his gaze was no longer a weapon meant to demean her. It was a desperate, heavy anchor holding him to the earth. The profound stillness in his posture communicated a single, devastating truth. He had been waiting for her to come back. For the next 10 days, a bizarre, silent truce settled over the alleyway, fundamentally altering the architecture of their lives. The psychological war morphed into a fragile, wordless coexistence. The glass separating them ceased to be a barrier and instead became a shared membrane, a canvas upon which their solitary routines played out in tandem. Hermione no longer read her contracts with an aggressive, rigid spine meant to challenge him. The tooth of old parchment still slipped beneath her fingers, but the frantic urgency was tempered. She found herself curling sideways into the velvet upholstery of her armchair, her legs tucked beneath her, allowing the soft, frayed edges of her true self to exist in his line of sight. When the autumn rain returned, drumming a relentless, hollow echo against her window pane, she would pause her reading, wrap her hands around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, and simply watch him. Draco, in turn, had entirely abandoned his attempts to conceal his presence. He kept a single dim reading light on in the corner of his minimalist living room. He would sit in a low leather chair, a thick file resting on his knees, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on the side table. He never drew the blinds. The scent of ozone and chilled cedar that usually accompanied him in the boardroom was replaced in her imagination by the dark, heavy aroma of aged scotch and the rain. They did not wave. They did not attempt to bridge the physical gap with juvenile gestures. The intimacy was entirely non-verbal, built on the profound realization that they were keeping each other company in the dark. If she shifted to turn a page, his eyes would flick up, tracking the movement with a quiet, intense focus. If he reached up to run a weary hand through his pale, disheveled hair, her breath would catch, a subtle, static electricity crawling over the nape of her neck. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful burn. The boundary between her space and his began to blur. She found herself dressing differently in the evenings, not for him, but because the awareness of his eyes demanded a strange reverence. She wore soft, draping cottons, letting her wild curls fall loose around her shoulders instead of pinning them back in her severe office bun. The warmth of this unspoken arrangement began to thaw the bitter frost that had defined their relationship for years. She began to see the man beneath the aristocratic sneer, a man who worked until 3 a.m, a man who massaged his temples with a quiet desperation, a man who stared out at the city lights with a melancholy so profound it made her heart physically ache. It was on a Tuesday night, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, that the delicate equilibrium finally ruptured. The wind was howling through the concrete canyons of the city, throwing sheets of water against the glass. Hermione had abandoned her desk entirely. She was sitting on the plush rug directly in front of the window, a thick, woven blanket draped over her shoulders. She was grading a stack of junior associate drafts, the red ink stark against the white paper. Across the way, Draco was standing by his window. He had been standing there for nearly an hour, motionless, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his dark trousers. The storm raged around them, but the bubble of silence between their eyes was absolute. Hermione looked up from her papers. The amber light of her lamp caught the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She felt a sudden, overwhelming swell of affection for this strange, solitary man who guarded her nights. The internal conflict that had warned her against trusting him had been entirely eroded by the gentle, consistent gravity of his presence. Acting on an impulse she couldn't suppress, Hermione reached beside her and picked up her ceramic mug. The tea was long cold, but that didn't matter. She looked directly at him, maintaining unbroken eye contact, and slowly, deliberately raised the mug in the air. It wasn't a mocking toast like the one he had offered weeks ago. It was a white flag, a gentle, hesitant greeting. I see you. I don't hate you anymore. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw Draco freeze. The catastrophic weight of his internal guilt, which had been temporarily subdued by the quiet magic of their shared routine, violently resurrected itself. Seeing her sitting there, so soft, so incredibly forgiving, offering him a piece of her warmth despite the cruelty he had inflicted upon her, tore through him like a serrated blade. He didn't see a truce. He saw a mirror reflecting his own unworthiness. He was a man who ruined things. He was arrogant, deeply flawed, and carried a darkness inside him that he believed would eventually suffocate her light. The bite of his silver ring bit painfully into his palm as his hands clenched into tight, bloodless fists inside his pockets. He felt the terrifying, consuming urge to cross the street, to shatter the glass, to bury his face in her neck and inhale the scent of her skin. And that craving terrified him more than anything he had ever known. He could not taint her. He could not allow his chaotic, fractured reality to bleed into her sanctuary. Hermione's soft smile faltered as she watched his posture turn incredibly rigid. The relaxed, weary man vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, untouchable spectre of Draco Malfoy. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle ticking beneath his pale skin. He didn't raise his glass. He didn't acknowledge her gesture. Instead, he took a sharp, mechanical step backward, retreating into the deep charcoal shadows of his apartment. Without breaking eye contact, he reached out, his hand wrapping around the cord of his reading lamp. No, Hermione thought, the single syllable echoing hollowly in her mind. Please, no. With a ruthless, definitive pull, Draco extinguished the light. His side of the alley plunged into an absolute, uncompromising void. The visual connection was severed with a brutal finality. Hermione was left sitting on her rug, her arms still raised, holding a cold mug of tea in the empty, brightly lit stage of her living room. The sudden drop in atmospheric pressure left her gasping for air. The warmth of the past 10 days evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a freezing, biting humiliation. The pendulum swung violently back. The doubt and betrayal crashed over her, a freezing wave that extinguished the delicate hope she had harbored. She lowered her arm, her hand trembling so violently the ceramic mug rattled against the floorboards as she set it down. She had offered him grace, and he had thrown it back in her face, rejecting her with a coldness that stung worse than his insults ever could. She stared into the black, unyielding rectangle across the street, the hollow echo of the rain mocking her foolishness. The slow burn had suddenly turned to ice, and the chasm between them had never felt wider. The following 3 days were a masterclass in psychological devastation. Hermione moved through her apartment like a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life she no longer recognized. She kept her lights on, stubbornly, defiantly, but she never once approached the glass. The wingback chair was dragged back to the far corner of the room, turned away from the window, creating a fortress of upholstery and shadow. The betrayal felt like a visceral alignment of all her worst fears. She had allowed her guard to drop. She had interpreted his silent companionship as a nascent form of intimacy, only for him to extinguish it with the clinical precision of a man snuffling out a candle he no longer found useful. The internal conflict was a screaming static in her mind. How could she have been so naive? How could she have mistaken the predatory stillness of a Malfoy for the weary loneliness of a peer? The repulsion she felt now wasn't the hot, energetic anger of their corporate battles. It was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She felt a frantic need to straighten every corner of her life, polishing her shoes until they shone like mirrors, organizing her briefcases with surgical neatness, buttoning her blouses all the way to the throat. If he was watching from the dark, she would give him nothing but the image of a woman who was entirely, terrifyingly composed. Across the alley, the darkness in Draco's apartment was absolute, but the silence inside it was a lie. Draco was drowning in the hollow echo of his own cowardice. He had spent 72 hours in a state of vibrating, tactile friction with his own conscience. He stood in the shadows of his kitchen, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at the glowing rectangle of her apartment. She was there, but she was gone. The soft, vulnerable girl who had raised her mug to him had been replaced by a rigid, distant figure who moved with a chilling, mechanical efficiency. He had intended to protect her from his own darkness, but he had succeeded only in wounding her. The memory of her faltering smile, the way her hand had trembled as she lowered that mug, was a jagged shard of glass embedded in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the magnetic pull of her presence, a phantom weight that made his own skin feel like a restrictive suit of armor he couldn't shed. He was morally grey, perhaps even darker than that, but for the first time in his life, the guilt wasn't a vague historical burden. It was a sharp, localized agony. On the fourth night, the City of London decided to intervene. A massive transformer 3 blocks away succumbed to the unrelenting autumn deluge, exploding in a spectacular shower of blue and white sparks that lit up the skyline for miles. In an instant, the hum of the city died. The street lamps flickered and expired. The glowing rectangles of the high-rise windows were snuffed out like birthday candles. Hermione was standing in her kitchen, reaching for a glass of water when the world went black. The sudden absence of light was so total, it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. The only sound was the frantic, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass and the thud of her own heart. She stood frozen, her fingers curled around the cold glass, waiting for her eyes to adjust. But there was no ambient light to catch. The storm had swallowed the moon, and the power outage had claimed the neon pulse of the streets. She felt a sudden, irrational surge of panic, a primitive fear of the dark that she hadn't felt since childhood. The vast, uncurtained window, once her window to the world, was now a gaping, black mouth. She fumbled her way toward the living room, her hands brushing against the walls for guidance. The air felt colder, the atmospheric pressure of the storm seeming to seep through the very bricks of the building. She reached her sofa and sank onto it, pulling her knees to her chest. "Just a blackout," she whispered, the sound of her own voice hollow and small. "It's just the rain." But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the cold began to bite. The heating system had failed along with the lights, and the damp chill of a London October began to permeate the flat. She shivered, her teeth beginning to chatter. She needed candles. She needed matches. But as she mentally catalogued her belongings, she realized with a jolt of despair that she had neither. She was a woman of technology and electricity. She hadn't owned a box of matches in years. She looked across the alley. In the window opposite hers, a tiny, flickering point of light appeared. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glare of a lamp. It was the soft, organic glow of a candle. Then another, and another. Draco Malfoy was moving through his apartment, illuminating the charcoal walls with a warm, dancing amber. The light caught the silver of his signet ring as he set a candelabra down on his low table. Through the rain-streaked glass, he looked like a figure from a 17th century oil painting, sharp, dramatic, and surrounded by gold. He walked to his window. He didn't look away this time. He held a single pillar candle in his hand, the flames steady despite the draft. He held it up, a mirror image of her gesture from nights before. Hermione watched him, her breath hitching in her throat. The betrayal was still there, a dull ache, but the sheer, visceral need for warmth and human connection was starting to override her pride. She was freezing, sitting in a black tomb, while 40 feet away there was fire and light. She saw him set the candle down on the sill. He lingered there for a moment, his silhouette dark against the internal glow. Then he did something he had never done. He reached for the latch of his window and pushed it open. The sound of the storm rushed into the alleyway, a roar of wind and the wet slap of rain. Hermione stood up, drawn to her own window by a force she couldn't name. She fumbled for the locks, her fingers stiff with cold, and heaved her own window upward. The impact of the elements was immediate. Cold, mist-fine rain sprayed across her face, smelling of wet pavement and old stone. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of the city's distress. "Granger!" His voice was a low, urgent rasp, barely audible over the wind, yet it vibrated through her bones. He was leaning out over the ledge, his hair being whipped into a pale frenzy by the gale. "The building's backup generator failed," he shouted, his voice stripped of all its usual corporate polish. "You're freezing over there. I can see you shivering from here." "I'm fine," she lied, her voice cracking. "You're a terrible liar, Hermione." The use of her first name was a jarring impact, a breach of every boundary they had ever constructed. It felt more intimate than a touch, a verbal alignment that bridged the chasm between them. "Come across," he commanded, though it sounded more like a plea. "The lobby doors are on manual release. My floor has a separate gas fireplace. Come across, or you'll be a block of ice by morning." "I can't just... For God's sake, Granger, put your pride in a drawer for one night." He slammed his window shut, but he didn't move away. He stayed there, his forehead pressed against the glass, watching her. Hermione stood in the spray of the rain, her heart a frantic, trapped bird. The repulsion fought with the magnetic pull. He had been cruel. He had been cold. But he was also the only person in this massive, dark city who was looking out for her. She closed her window, the silence of her flat returning with a suffocating weight. She didn't think. If she thought, she would stay. She grabbed her heavy wool coat, fumbled for her keys in the dark, and practically ran out her front door. The stairwell was a nightmare of shadows, illuminated only by the weak, dying glow of the emergency floor strips. She descended the 9 flights with a frantic urgency, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the concrete shaft. By the time she burst out of her building's front door and into the rain, she was already soaked. The alleyway was a canyon of wind. She ducked her head, sprinting across the slick bricks toward the imposing black doors of the building opposite. As she reached them, they swung open before she could even touch the handle. Draco was standing there, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say a word. He stepped back, allowing her to stumble into the marble-floored lobby. The air was marginally warmer here, smelling of expensive wax and damp wool. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to steady her, but he didn't make contact. The restraint was palpable, a vibrating tension that made the atmospheric pressure in the lobby feel 10 times heavier than the storm outside. "The lift is dead," he said, his voice dropping back into a low, controlled register. It's 9 flights. I just came down 9, she panted, pushing a wet coil of hair away from her eyes. I can go up 9. They climbed the stairs in a heavy, charged silence. The only sounds were their synchronized breathing and the rhythmic thud-thud of their boots on the carpeted treads. With every floor they ascended, the air seemed to grow thicker, the static between them building, until Hermione felt like she might shatter from the sheer proximity of him. When they finally reached the 9th floor, he led her down the hallway to his door. He unlocked it, the heavy oak swinging inward to reveal a world bathed in the flickering golden light of dozens of candles. The apartment was exactly as she had seen it through the binoculars, minimalist, charcoal and masculine. But the fire in the hearth changed everything. It cast long, dancing shadows that softened the sharp edges of the furniture. The scent of wood smoke and bergamot was overwhelming, a visceral embrace that made her knees feel weak. "Take your coat off," he said, moving toward the fireplace to stoke the embers. "You're dripping on the floor." Hermione shed her sodden coat, draping it over a chair near the door. She felt small and incredibly vulnerable in her damp sweater and leggings. She walked slowly toward the fire, her eyes darting around the room, taking in the reality of his life. There were no photos, no personal trinkets, just books, vast, towering shelves of them that she hadn't been able to see from across the street. "You have a lot of poetry," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Draco paused, the poker frozen in his hand. He didn't look at her. "It's a quiet hobby, Granger. Don't read too much into it." He stood up, turning to face her. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the hollows of his cheeks and the intensity of his eyes. The distance between them was less than 5 feet now, and the magnetic pull was so strong it was almost dizzying. "You're still shivering," he noted, his eyes scanning her face with a strange, fierce concern. He moved to a mahogany wardrobe in the corner, pulling out a thick white button-down shirt. Heavy, expensive cotton. "Go into the bathroom. Change into this. I'll put your sweater by the fire." He held the shirt out. As Hermione reached for it, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was electric, a jarring impact that sent a shockwave straight to her core. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The world outside, the storm, the blackout, the corporate rivalry, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his skin against hers and the suffocating tension of everything they hadn't said. Draco was the first to pull away, his hand dropping as if burned. "Go," he said, his voice thick, "before you catch pneumonia and sue me for negligence." Hermione retreated to the bathroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She changed quickly, the heavy fabric of his shirt smelling so strongly of him it felt like he was holding her. It was far too big, the hem reaching her mid-thighs, the sleeves swallowing her hands. She rolled them up, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she emerged, he was sitting on the rug in front of the fire, 2 glasses of amber liquid waiting on the low table. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw a flash of something other than arrogance or guilt in his eyes. He saw her in his clothes, soft and attractive, and entirely within his reach. "Better?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "Better," she replied, crossing the room to sit beside him, the warmth of the fire finally beginning to soak into her bones. The night was far from over, and the slow burn was about to become a blaze. The The transition from the freezing, howling chaos of the storm to the insulated, golden hush of Draco's living room was almost too much for Hermione's senses to process. The air here was still, weighted with the scent of burning birchwood and the expensive underlying musk of sandalwood. The candles, scores of them, placed on every available flat surface, flickered in the draughts that rattled the heavy glass, casting a chaotic, shifting tapestry of shadows against the charcoal walls. She sat on the plush, dark rug, her legs tucked beneath her. The heavy cotton of his shirt felt like a second skin, the hem brushing against her bare thighs, the fabric still retaining a ghost of his body heat. Across the small space of the hearth, Draco sat with his back against the sofa, one knee drawn up, his arm resting casually upon it. The firelight carved deep, dramatic hollows into his face, making him look less like the polished executive she loathed, and more like a man stripped to his essential, jagged parts. He handed her one of the glasses. The crystal was heavy, the amber liquid inside swirling with a viscous grace. "Drink," he murmured. "It's a 25-year-old Lagavulin. It'll do more for your circulation than the fire." Hermione took a sip. The liquid was a violent, smoky bloom across her tongue, a peat-heavy warmth that slid down her throat and settled in her chest like a glowing coal. She exhaled slowly, watching the way the flames reflected in the depths of her glass. The silence between them was no longer the sharp, jagged thing of the coffee shop. It had evolved into something dense and atmospheric, a physical pressure that made every breath feel significant. "Why poetry, Draco?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the cavernous room. He didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, his pale eyes tracking the ascent of a single spark. "When you spend your entire day navigating the world in numbers and ironclad clauses, you begin to crave something that doesn't have a bottom line, something that can't be liquidated." He took a slow drink, his throat bobbing. "And it's a quiet way to be angry at the world, to read words that have survived longer than the empires that birthed them." He turned his head then, his gaze heavy and unblinking. "You, on the other hand, read biographies, lives already lived, maps of how to succeed. It's very you, Granger, always looking for the instructions." Hermione felt the familiar prickle of irritation, but it was dampened by the wine-dark intimacy of the hour. "I like to know that things can be solved, that there is a beginning, a middle, and a logical conclusion. Is that so wrong?" "It's optimistic," he countered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a real smile, devoid of malice. "And remarkably dangerous. Most things in life don't conclude. They just stop, or they rot from the inside out." "Is that how you see yourself?" she asked, her boldness fueled by the scotch. "As something that's just waiting to stop?" The atmospheric pressure in the room spiked. Draco's jaw tightened, the muscle ticking beneath his skin. He set his glass down on the floor with a soft clink. "I see myself as a man who has lived 40 feet away from a sun for 6 months and finally realized he was a fool for thinking he could stay in the shadows forever." He shifted, moving off the sofa and onto the rug, closing the distance between them until their knees were inches apart. The visceral alignment of their bodies was undeniable. She could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the ozone and rain still clinging to his skin. "I saw you, Hermione," he said, his voice dropping into a register so low it was almost a vibration. I saw you cry when you thought the world wasn't looking. I saw you dance to that god-awful jazz record when you were happy. I saw you fall asleep over your books 100 times. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, trembling with a restrained, chaotic energy. And every time I watched you, I hated myself a little more, because I wanted to be the one to tell you to go to bed. I wanted to be the one to turn off the music. I wanted to be the one who made you cry for a reason that wasn't a corporate merger. Hermione's breath hitched. The internal monologue she had maintained for years, the one where Draco Malfoy was a heartless, arrogant shadow, collapsed entirely. She saw the internal guilt he carried, the way he viewed himself as a blight upon her light. She saw the emotionally broken man behind the silver signet ring. "Then why did you turn the light off?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That night, when I raised my glass, why did you leave me in the dark?" Draco's eyes darkened with a profound, agonizing regret. "Because I realized I was starting to love a ghost, and if I didn't stop, I was going to do something catastrophic, like walk across that alleyway and ruin your life with mine. I thought if I killed the light, I could kill the feeling." He finally let his hand fall, his fingers grazing the cuff of his shirt where it hung off her arm. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shockwave of tactile friction through her entire body. "I was wrong," he whispered. "The dark only made the image of you sharper." Hermione felt a tear escape, hot and traitorous, tracing a path down her cheek. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, a magnetic pull so strong it felt like the very walls of the apartment were leaning in. She didn't feel like the strong, principled woman who won cases. She felt vulnerable, seen, and desperately, achingly alive. "You didn't ruin anything, Draco," she said, her voice catching. "You were the only thing I looked for in the morning. Even when I hated you, I was looking for you." The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Outside, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the glass, but inside, the world had shrunk to the space between their lips. Draco leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat, to pull back into the safety of her professional disdain. But Hermione didn't move. She leaned forward, meeting him halfway. The first kiss wasn't a collision of passion. It was a tentative, heart-wrenching inquiry. His lips were cool, tasting of scotch and salt, and they moved against hers with a reverence that made her heart ache. It was a slow surrender, a quiet acknowledgement of the months of silent watching, the weeks of bitter words, and the days of shared darkness. Draco let out a low, shuddering moan against her mouth, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind her ear. The contact was electric, a grounding force that anchored her to the present. He kissed her as if he were trying to memorize the texture of her soul, his touch hesitant, as if he expected her to vanish like a mirage if he gripped too hard. Hermione reached up, her fingers tangling in the soft, pale hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer, deepening the kiss, breaking the last of the barriers between them. The slow burn had finally caught, igniting a heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He tasted of regret and hidden longing, of the cold rain and the warm fire. When they finally pulled apart, just a fraction of an inch, their foreheads rested against each other, their breathing synchronized and heavy. I have wanted to do that since February, he rasped, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the old hostility. I've wanted to hit you since February, she whispered back, a small, watery laugh escaping her. But I think I prefer this. Draco's hand slid down her neck, his fingers tracing the collar of his shirt where it lay against her collarbone. The intimacy was overwhelming, a visceral alignment of two people who had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. Stay, he said. It wasn't a command this time. It was a prayer. The storm isn't over. Stay until the morning. Stay until the lights come back. Hermione looked into his eyes and saw not the rival, not the predator, but the man who had guarded her from across the street. She saw the person who had sat in the dark so she wouldn't have to be alone. I'm not going anywhere, Draco, she promised. He kissed her again, this time with more certainty, the warmth of the fire casting their joined shadows long and deep against the dark walls of the room. The power was still out, the city was still dark, but for the first time in 6 months, Hermione Granger was exactly where she was meant to be. The world outside the high-rise had ceased to exist. London was a drowned, silent ghost, buried under the weight of the blackout and the unrelenting percussion of the rain. Inside the sanctuary of charcoal walls and flickering amber, the atmospheric pressure had reached a point of absolute, exquisite density. The air felt thick, charged with the scent of melting wax, the dying embers of the scotch, and the sharp metallic tang of the storm that still clung to their hair. They were no longer two figures framed by glass. They were two bodies sharing the same air, the same rug, the same desperate mounting heat. Draco's hands were no longer hesitant. Having finally breached the perimeter of her life, he seemed possessed by a hunger that was as much about confirmation as it was about desire. His palms were large and warm, framing Hermione's face with a proprietary intensity that made her breath hitch. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, his touch firm enough to leave a phantom heat on her skin. He looked at her, not as a rival to be defeated, but as a miracle to be deciphered. "You're real," he whispered, the words vibrating against her lips. "I've spent so long imagining the tilt of your head, the way you move when you think no one is there to judge you, that I started to believe you were a projection of my own loneliness." Hermione reached up, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of his shirt, the shirt she was currently wearing. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was wrapped in his scent, shielded by his cloth, and yet she felt more exposed than she ever had under the glare of her halogen lamps. "I was never a projection, Draco," she murmured, her voice sounding foreign in her own ears, softened by a vulnerability she had spent a decade suppressing. "I was right there. I was waiting for you to see me, not just watch me. I needed you to see me." The visceral alignment of their bodies was absolute as he pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, drawing her flush against his chest. The starched cotton of his waistcoat and the heavy silk of his shirt felt like a barrier he was eager to dismantle. Hermione leaned into him, her forehead resting against his shoulder, inhaling the deep, comforting aroma of cedar and the faint, bitter ghost of his evening cigarettes. Slowly, deliberately, Draco began to trail kisses down the column of her throat. Each touch was a slow burn, a tactile friction that sent shivers racing toward her extremities. He lingered at the sensitive pulse point beneath her ear, his breath hot and ragged. "I have been a coward, Hermione," he rasped against her skin. "I've lived my life behind glass because it was safe, because if I didn't touch anything, I couldn't break it. But watching you, it made the safety feel like a cage." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The silver in his gaze was no longer cold. It was molten, swirling with a mixture of raw longing and an internal guilt that was finally, mercifully, being overtaken by his need for her. He reached for the hem of the oversized shirt she wore, his knuckles brushing the bare skin of her thigh. The contact was electric, a jarring impact that made her entire body tingle. With a silent, questioning look, he waited for her signal. Hermione didn't hesitate. She placed her hand over his, guiding him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The slow burn of their 6-month surveillance was erupting into something far more profound than mere physical release. This was the collapse of 2 fortresses, the merging of 2 shadows. He stood up, never breaking eye contact, and offered her his hand. Hermione took it, her fingers curling around his, the weight of his signet ring a cold, grounding contrast to the heat of his palm. He led her toward the bedroom, a space she had never seen through her binoculars, tucked away from the prying eyes of the street. It was a room of deep shadows and soft linens, illuminated only by a single stout candle on the nightstand. The rain was a distant, muffled roar here. The sound of the storm filtered through heavy drapes that Draco had finally, ironically, drawn shut. The intimacy that followed was a veiled, beautiful symphony of non-verbal communication. It was the way his hands shook as he helped her slip the shirt from her shoulders, the way she traced the sharp, elegant line of his collarbone with her tongue, the way their breaths hitched in perfect unison as they finally, completely shed the last of their defenses. There was no vulgarity, only a profound, searing intensity. Every touch was an answer to a question asked months ago. Every look was a confession. In the dim, flickering light, their bodies were a study in contrasts. Her warmth and his pale moonlight skin. Her wild, unrestrained curls and his disciplined, aristocratic features. They moved together with a fluid, desperate grace, as if they were trying to merge their very atoms to prevent the city from ever separating them again. The tension between them, the years of boardroom battles, the months of silent watching, the days of freezing darkness, was finally transmuted into a powerful, grounding peace. As the climax of their union arrived, it wasn't an explosion, but a deep, resonant surrender. Draco buried his face in the crook of her neck, his body trembling with a release that was as much emotional as it was physical. Hermione held him, her arms locked around his back, her eyes closed as she drifted in the warm, golden aftermath. Hours later, the storm had finally begun to exhaust itself. The aggressive drumming on the glass had faded to a rhythmic, gentle tapping. Inside the bedroom, the candle had burned down to a low, guttering nub, casting a soft orange glow over the tangled sheets. Hermione lay on her side, her head resting on Draco's chest. She could hear the steady, calming beat of his heart, a rhythmic metronome that replaced the ticking of his expensive watch. His arm was draped over her, his hand resting on her waist, his thumb lazily tracing circles against her skin. The tactile friction was no longer a weapon, it was a reassurance. "The power will be back soon," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. The city won't stay dark forever. Draco shifted, his chin resting on the top of her head. He tightened his grip on her, as if afraid she might evaporate with the coming dawn. Let it stay dark for a little while longer. I'm not ready to go back to being a silhouette. You aren't a silhouette anymore, she said, lifting her head to look at him. In the fading candlelight, he looked softer, the hard edges of his cynicism smoothed away by the night. I see you, Draco. I see all of you. He reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her temple. I think I'm going to have to buy you those curtains, Granger. I don't think I can handle the idea of anyone else looking into your life now that I know what's inside. Hermione smiled, a genuine, radiant thing that seemed to light up the room more than any candle could. Or you could just stay on this side of the glass. It's much warmer here. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was slow, sweet, and filled with a quiet, certain hope. It was a kiss of belonging, a final resolution to the conflict that had defined them. The slow burn had reached its end, leaving behind a steady, enduring flame. They drifted back into a light, peaceful sleep as the first hints of a pale grey dawn began to bleed through the edges of the curtains. The blackout was still in effect. The world was still quiet. But for the first time in their lives, the silence wasn't lonely. It was a shared, sacred space, a foundation built on the wreckage of their prejudices and the beauty of being truly, undeniably seen. The morning arrived not with a sudden flare of light, but with a slow, creeping grey that bled through the heavy velvet drapes of Draco's bedroom. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a city that felt scrubbed clean, the air outside the glass crisp and smelling of petrichor and cold stone. Inside, the last of the candles had long since drowned in their own wax, leaving the room in a soft, ethereal twilight. Hermione stirred first. The transition from the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted to the waking world was unusually gentle. There was no jarring impact of reality, no immediate rush of professional anxiety. Instead, there was the heavy, grounding weight of Draco's arm across her midsection and the rhythmic, warm puff of his breath against the nape of her neck. She lay still for a long moment, watching the dust motes dance in the sliver of light that managed to penetrate the curtains. The tactile friction of the silk sheets against her skin and the solid heat of the man behind her felt like a new kind of magic, one that didn't require wands or incantations, but a simple, profound surrender to the present. The internal monologue that usually critiqued her every move was silent, replaced by a quiet, resonant peace. She felt Draco shift. The arm around her tightened instinctively before his fingers began a slow, wandering exploration of her side. "You're awake," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a fresh tremor of awareness through her. "The silence woke me," she replied softly, turning within the circle of his arms to face him. In the pale morning light, Draco looked remarkably unguarded. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his face were softened by sleep, his silver eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that he no longer tried to mask. The man who had been a predatory spectre in a charcoal-painted room was gone, replaced by someone who looked as though he had finally found his way home after a very long, very cold journey. "The power is back," he noted, nodding toward the digital clock on the nightstand, which was now blinking a steady, rhythmic blue. The world has returned to its scheduled programming. "Let it blink," Hermione said, reaching up to trace the faint silver scar on his shoulder with her thumb. "I'm not ready for the world yet." "Neither am I." He caught her hand, pressing a lingering kiss to her palm. "I've spent 3 years fighting you in boardrooms and 6 months watching you from across an alleyway. I think I'm owed at least one morning where the only thing on the agenda is making sure you don't disappear." The magnetic pull that had defined their relationship, that tense, exhausting attraction, had stabilized into a deep, gravitational force. It was no longer a war of opposites, but a visceral alignment of two souls who had finally admitted they were tired of being alone. They eventually migrated to the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool beneath their bare feet. Hermione was once again wearing his white shirt, the cuffs rolled high, the fabric swaying around her thighs as she moved. Draco followed her, his own shirt unbuttoned, the casual disarray of his appearance a stark contrast to the ironclad perfection he maintained at the office. He began to make coffee, the mechanical hum of the grinder sounding like a celebratory fanfare in the quiet apartment. The scent of roasted beans soon filled the air, mingling with the lingering aroma of wood smoke from the fireplace. Hermione sat on the edge of the kitchen island, watching him move. He worked with a quiet, efficient grace, his movements devoid of the usual arrogance. "What happens tomorrow, Draco?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes filled with a lingering, soft doubt. "When the elevators are working and the streetlights are on, and we both have to walk back into those buildings that expect us to be ruthless?" Draco paused, the silver carafe in his hand. He looked across the kitchen at her, this brilliant, fierce woman who had broken through his glass walls. "Tomorrow, I'll probably walk into the boardroom and find a dozen ways to complicate your life professionally, because it's the only way I know how to keep your attention during office hours." He set the coffee down and walked over to her, stepping between her knees and resting his hands on her waist. "But every evening, when the sun goes down, I'm going to look across that alleyway. And if your lights are on, I'm going to come over and make sure you've eaten. And if they're off, I'm going to wait at my window until you come home." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "There is no back, Hermione. I've seen too much of you now. I can't go back to being the man who just watches." "Good," she whispered, her fingers tangling in the hair at the base of his neck. "Because I've decided I quite like having an audience, as long as it's only you." They spent the morning in a haze of gentle intimacy, talking about the things they had noticed about each other through their respective windows. Draco confessed to knowing exactly which book she reached for when she was stressed. Hermione admitted she knew he only smoked when he was struggling with a particular deal. They laughed at the absurdity of their silent Cold War, the humour serving as a final bridge over the wreckage of their old prejudices. Eventually, the reality of their lives began to beckon. Hermione needed to return to her own apartment to change for the day, to assess the damage from the storm, and to finally, officially, deal with her broken curtain rod. Draco walked her to the door. As he opened it, the hallway of the building was brightly lit, the elevator dings echoing in the distance. The city was waking up, moving on from the chaos of the night. "I'll see you at the office," she asked, pausing in the doorway. "Count on it, Granger. I believe we have a dispute over the Sterling merger at 10. He reached out, hooking a finger under her chin and tilting her face up. He kissed her then, a slow, deep and incredibly certain kiss that tasted of coffee and new beginnings. It was a promise, sealed in the light of day. Hermione walked down the stairs, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. When she reached the ground floor and stepped out into the alleyway, she stopped and looked up. Her window on the 9th floor was still bare, a dark rectangle against the brick. But across from it, Draco's window was no longer a void. He was standing there, framed by the charcoal walls, watching her. He didn't have binoculars. He didn't have a glass of scotch. He simply had a hand raised in a quiet, steady wave. Hermione waved back, a bright, genuine smile breaking across her face. The first thing she did when she got into her apartment was look at the collapsed curtain rod lying on the floor. It was a twisted piece of metal, a symbol of her isolation and her stubbornness. She picked it up, carried it to the utility closet, and shoved it into the back corner behind her suitcases and old boxes. She walked back to the window and looked out. The view was the same. The bricks, the rain-slicked alley, the towering building opposite. But the perspective had shifted irrevocably. The glass was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. She didn't need curtains. She didn't need to hide. For the first time in her life, she was perfectly happy to be seen, because she knew exactly who was looking. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the city in a pale, triumphant gold, Hermione Granger sat down at her desk. She didn't open her legal files. Instead, she took a piece of stationery and a pen. 10 o'clock, Malfoy, she wrote, her handwriting elegant and bold. Try not to be late. I have a feeling I'm going to win this one. She folded the note into a small square and leaned it against the glass of her window, facing out. Across the way, she saw Draco move closer to his own pane, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The window opposite the window was no longer an eyesore or a distraction. It was the most beautiful view in London. The glass-walled boardroom of Sterling and Associates sat on the 44th floor, suspended like a predatory bird over the silver ribbing of the Thames. Outside, the London sky had traded its stormy charcoal for a deceptive, piercing blue, but inside, the atmospheric pressure was thick enough to choke. The hum of the air conditioning was a sterile mechanical drone, a sharp contrast to the wild, organic drumming of the rain that had soundtracked the previous night. Hermione sat at the head of the mahogany table, her spine a rigid, uncompromising line. She was the picture of corporate perfection. Her hair was tamed into a severe, high knot, and her charcoal blazer was buttoned precisely, the silk of her blouse reflecting the harsh overhead LED lights. But beneath the table, her pulse was a frantic, rhythmic staccato. Every time she inhaled, she caught the ghostly, lingering scent of sandalwood and expensive cedar. Scents that didn't belong in a boardroom. Scents that belonged to a 9th-floor sanctuary 40 feet across a rain-slicked alley. Across from her, Draco Malfoy was dismantling her third-quarter projections with the clinical precision of a surgeon. The logistical overhead in the East Anglian sector is inflated by nearly 12%, Granger, he drawled, his voice a low, aristocratic vibration that scraped against her nerves like a violin bow. He didn't look at her. He was focused on a sleek black tablet, his thumbs scrolling through data with a detached elegance. It's sloppy. It suggests a lack of foresight that I find disappointing. The word disappointing landed with a jarring impact. To the 6 other junior associates and partners in the room, it was a standard Malfoy barb, a cold, professional dismissal. But to Hermione, who still felt the ghost of his lips against the hollow of her throat, it was a challenge, a play, a desperate attempt to re-establish the magnetic pull of their public rivalry before the private warmth of the blackout consumed them both. She leaned forward, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her silver fountain pen. It isn't sloppy, Malfoy. It's a calculated buffer for the volatility of the current market. Perhaps if you spent less time looking for flaws and more time understanding the nuances of the merger, you'd see the merit in the strategy. Draco finally lifted his gaze. His pale silver eyes were hooded, a mask of icy indifference firmly back in place. But as they locked onto hers, the static in the room spiked. For a microsecond, the boardroom vanished. The suit, the mahogany, the hovering associates. All of it was replaced by the memory of him standing in his kitchen, his hair disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned, looking at her as if she were the only light left in a dark city. The visceral alignment of their secrets was a heavy, intoxicating weight. He knew the exact curve of her shoulder. She knew the way his breathing hitched when he was truly vulnerable. Merit is a subjective term, he countered, his voice dropping an octave. He reached up, adjusting his silk tie with a slow, deliberate movement. The bite of his silver signet ring against the dark fabric was a visual anchor. I prefer certainty. Then you must lead a very dull life, she snapped, the retort coming fast and sharp, a practiced defense. A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his mouth. A private signal, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity of their situation. The internal monologue in Hermione's head was a chaotic loop of disbelief. They were playing a part. They were pretending the walls hadn't come down. But the tactile friction of the memory of his skin was so intense, she felt as though she might vibrate out of her chair. The meeting dragged on for another hour, a grueling marathon of legal jargon and financial posturing. To the outside observer, it was business as usual. The legendary friction between Granger and Malfoy providing the necessary sparks to keep the merger moving. But every time their hands brushed while passing a folder, or their eyes met over the rim of a coffee cup, the atmospheric pressure reached a breaking point. When the senior partner finally called for a recess, the room emptied with a flurry of rustling paper and muffled whispers. Hermione stayed behind, ostensibly to organize her notes, her fingers trembling slightly as she straightened her already perfect sleeve cuffs. She felt him before she heard him. The air in the room shifted, growing heavy with that familiar magnetic pull. The door clicked shut. Draco didn't move toward her immediately. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he had watched her from for 6 months. "You're late with your rebuttal on the pension fund, Granger," he said, his back still turned. The professional mask was slipping, the aristocratic drawl replaced by something raw and weary. "I was busy," she replied, her voice soft, the boardroom armor cracking. "The power was out, if you recall. I had distractions." Draco turned slowly. He had discarded his suit jacket over a chair, and his white shirt was a stark, brilliant contrast to the charcoal walls of the office, a mirrored image of the room across the alley. He walked toward her, his footsteps hollow echoes against the polished floorboards. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over her chair, his shadow engulfing her. The distractions were mutual, he murmured. He reached down, his fingers grazing the wood of the table, just inches from her hand. The restraint he was exercising was palpable, a vibrating tension that made the air feel electric. I find it incredibly difficult to focus on logistical overhead when I can still feel the way you look in my clothes. Hermione's breath hitched. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide and searching. We can't do this here, Draco. We're in a glass box. Everyone can see. Let them look, he whispered, a flash of his old defiance surfacing. I've spent half a year being the only one watching you. I'm starting to think the rest of the world deserves to see how much of a fool I've become. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, before he finally allowed his thumb to trace the line of her jaw. The contact was a jarring impact, a grounding force that shattered the last of her professional distance. The internal conflict, the fear of her career, the terror of her vulnerability, was silenced by the sheer overwhelming reality of his touch. "You aren't a fool," she said, her voice a fractured rasp. "I am," he countered, a sad, beautiful smile touching his lips. "I'm a man who spent 3 years trying to prove I was better than you, only to realize I'm not even whole without you." The vulnerability in his voice was a physical strike to her sternum. This was the emotionally broken man she had seen by the fire, the one who viewed his own life as a series of failures. Hermione stood up, closing the final inch of distance between them. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the silk of his tie, pulling him down until their foreheads rested against each other. "We have to finish this merger," she whispered against his lips. "I know." "We have to keep pretending." "I know." He kissed her then, a brief, desperate collision that tasted of mint and adrenaline. It was a kiss of necessity, a quick refueling before they stepped back out into the cold, judgmental light of the office. It was the approach after a morning of repulsion, a warmth that made the sterile boardroom feel like a sanctuary. They pulled apart as the sound of footsteps approached in the hallway. Draco moved back to his side of the table, his face instantly smoothing into a mask of cold, professional detachment. He picked up his tablet, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the device. The door opened and the associates filed back in, their voices a dull white roar. "As I was saying, Granger," Draco said, his voice once again a sharp, aristocratic blade. "Your projections for the East Anglian sector are a fantasy. If you can't provide a more realistic figure by tomorrow morning, I'll be forced to recommend a complete restructuring." Hermione sat back, her heart hammered against her ribs, a secret smile playing at the corners of her mouth that no one but him would understand. "I'll have the figures on your desk by 8, Malfoy. Try to keep up." The meeting resumed, the silent war continuing, but the foundation had shifted. The static was no longer a sign of conflict, but a secret language. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the room, Hermione looked at the window opposite the boardroom window. She saw her reflection, strong, capable, and no longer alone. She knew that in a few hours the lights in her apartment would come on, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of who would be watching. She was looking forward to it. The final week of October descended upon London with a quiet, biting frost that crystallized the breath of the city. For Hermione, the atmosphere of her daily life had undergone a tectonic shift. The seesaw of their previous existence, that violent, erratic fluctuation between burning resentment and chilled indifference, had finally stilled into a deep, resonant hum. They were no longer two predatory forces circling each other in a glass arena. They were a visceral alignment of two lives finally moving in the same direction. Yet, as she stepped out of the elevator on the 9th floor after a grueling 14-hour day at the firm, a familiar tremor of anxiety prickled at her skin. The professional mask she wore, the one Draco had spent the day helping her maintain with his sharp, calculated barbs in the boardroom, felt heavy and restrictive. She needed the sanctuary of her home. She needed the silence of the glass. As she turned the key in her lock, the first thing she noticed was the scent. It wasn't the stale, dusty air of an empty apartment. It was the sharp, clean bite of cedarwood and the faint, citrusy trail of bergamot. Her heart gave a sudden, erratic leap against her ribs. She pushed the door open and stopped dead in the threshold. The hallway was dark, but the living room was bathed in a soft architectural glow. The first thing her eyes tracked was the ceiling. The gaping, jagged wound where the plaster had crumbled months ago was gone. In its place was a smooth, pristine expanse of white, repaired with a seamless precision that suggested a master's touch. And then there was the window, a new curtain rod, heavy, brushed bronze with elegant, understated finials, spanned the width of the glass. Hanging from it were drapes of a deep, midnight blue velvet, the fabric looking thick enough to swallow the sound of a thunderstorm. But they weren't drawn. They were pinned wide open with silk ties, framing the view of the city like a grand stage. Hermione walked slowly into the center of the room, her boots clicking softly against the hardwood. The tactile friction of the velvet as she brushed her fingers against the drapes made her breath hitch. This wasn't just a repair, it was a surrender. It was Draco's way of giving her back her sanctuary, while simultaneously acknowledging that the barrier between them had been permanently dismantled. She looked across the alleyway. Draco's apartment was a mirror of her own warmth. He had replaced his harsh floor lamps with a series of low amber sconces that made the charcoal walls look like soft suede. He was standing by his window, his silhouette dark and familiar. He didn't have a glass of scotch. He wasn't smoking. He was simply waiting. Acting on a sudden, overwhelming magnetic pull, Hermione didn't reach for her own lights. She turned on her heel, left her apartment, and crossed the hall. She didn't knock. The door was unlocked, a silent invitation that spoke of a trust neither of them would have thought possible a month ago. The air in Draco's living room was warm, flavored by the low hiss of the gas fireplace. He turned as she entered, his pale eyes catching the firelight. He had discarded his tie and his waistcoat. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to expose the tense, elegant lines of his forearms. The internal guilt that usually shadowed his features was replaced by a quiet, grounding peace. "The contractor finished an hour ago," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. "I hope the color is to your liking. I thought the blue would match the way the sky looks just before the streetlights take over." Hermione didn't answer with words. She crossed the room in 3 strides, her coat falling to the floor as she reached him. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling him down, her face burying into the crook of his shoulder. The scent of him, ozone, rain, and that deep masculine cedar, was the only home she recognized now. "You fixed it," she whispered into his skin. "I couldn't have you shivering in the dark anymore, Hermione," he murmured, his large hands splaying across her back, holding her with a fierce, protective intensity. And I realized I didn't want the curtains closed. I just wanted the choice to be yours. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. The static between them was no longer a sign of conflict. It was the hum of a machine finally running in perfect sync. I've spent so much of my life being a ghost, watching people from the shadows, because I was afraid of what would happen if I stepped into the light, he said, his voice fracturing with a raw, honest vulnerability. I thought I was a ruin, a man who broke things just by touching them. But you look at me as if I'm something worth keeping. You are, she said, her voice a fierce, unyielding vow. You're the only thing in this city that feels real to me, Draco. The internal monologue that had once shouted warnings of his arrogance and his cruelty was now a soft, melodic background noise. She saw the man he had become, the morally grey, emotionally broken soul who had found his redemption in the simple act of watching someone exist without judgment. The transition from words to touch was inevitable, a slow burn that had been smouldering for 6 months. Draco led her toward the sofa, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that played across their joined forms. There was no approach and repulsion tonight. There was only a deep, soulful surrender. They talked for hours in the flickering glow, not about mergers or contracts, but about the small, quiet fears that kept them up at night. He told her about the weight of his family's expectations, the hollow echo of the sprawling manor he grew up in, and the desperate, secret craving he had always had for a life that was his own. She told him about the pressure of being the brightest, the fastest, the most principled, and the crushing loneliness that came with being a son that everyone looked at but no one ever touched. "I touched the sun," he whispered, his lips grazing her forehead, "and I didn't burn." As the clock ticked toward midnight, the intimacy deepened. It was a veiled, sensual culmination of their journey, a series of soft kisses that tasted of peppermint and peace, of hands exploring skin with a reverence that felt like a prayer. It wasn't about the friction of their rivalry anymore. It was about the viscosity of their shared future. They stayed together until the morning, wrapped in each other's warmth, two people who had finally stopped fighting the gravity that pulled them together. When the sun finally rose, a pale, wintry gold that illuminated the frost on the windows, the city of London woke up to a new reality. Hermione and Draco stood together at his window, looking out over the alleyway. Her apartment across the way was bright and clean, the new blue curtains pinned wide, letting the morning light flood the space. "I have to go to work," she said, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. "I know," Draco replied, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I believe I have an appointment with a very stubborn acquisitions lawyer at 10. I'm planning on being incredibly difficult." Hermione laughed, a clear, joyous sound that echoed in the quiet room. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The story of the window opposite the window had reached its final resolution. The seesaw had stopped. The rot in the foundation had been repaired. They were no longer silhouettes in separate boxes, separated by 40 feet of empty air and years of prejudice. As they walked out of the apartment together, hand in hand, the reflection in the glass showed a single, unified image. The rivalry was a ghost. The love was the only thing with weight. Hermione reached up, adjusting the collar of his coat, her fingers lingering on the silver signet ring that had once been a symbol of his coldness. He caught her hand, kissing her knuckles, his eyes bright with a happy, certain future. The window remained open, a testament to a love that had begun in the dark, blossomed in a blackout, and was now strong enough to stand in the full, unyielding light of day.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than just windows. It is about being brave. It is about letting someone see the real you. Sometimes we build walls to stay safe. We hide in the dark. We pretend that we are strong. But everyone needs to be seen. Everyone needs a hand to hold when the light go out. Draco and Hermione found each other in the silence. They stopped fighting the world and started trusting each other. I hope this story reminded you of something beautiful. Love is the way that you can choose. I love writing about these characters and their deep feeling. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe, leave a comment and tell me your favorite moment. What should I write next? A library romance or maybe a dark magic mystery? Tell me below. Until next time, keep looking for the light.